Welcome to Pharos Technology. Today what we're going to talk about is domain aggregate functions. So let's explain what those are and get started. So domain aggregate functions are basically a function that the domain in the name refers to the entire data set. So a domain function is going to do something over the entire data set. Now, when we have aggregate functions, in other words, totals queries, we're going to be summing or counting or averaging any number of records based on a group by that we usually group in the previous field. Well, a domain aggregate function, even if you have grouping, will sum or average or count the entire data set. Now, aggregate queries group before they evaluate the values, whereas domain aggregate queries evaluate the values for the entire data set. Now, domain aggregate function will only return one value. Now, logically thinking, it only returns one value because there's only going to be one total count of the records. There's only going to be one average or one sum of the data that's in the field. So it only returns a single value, even though that single value might be on each record. And we'll show you that here as we set one up. So how do we set up a domain aggregate function? First off, you start with function name, then field name, then data set, and then criteria. The function name is going to be Dsum, the letter D, and then sum, just like in your aggregate queries, you can sum. There's dcount, there's daverage, and there's several other standard deviation and so forth that have a domain aggregate function as well. The field name is required. You have to tell it what field you want to have summed or counted or averaged. You have to tell it what table that field is from. And then optionally, you can add criteria to it if you desire. So you can say that I only am interested in records that are over a certain amount or under a certain amount, or that are from the state of California, or any of those type of criteria. If there is no criteria, the function is just performed over the entire table or query that you're using. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the difference between Dsum and sum. Now, Dsum is, of course, the domain sum, and sum is going to be a regular totals query type aggregate that's going to be based on whatever grouping that we have. So here's the query that we set out. First off, it is a totals query. You can tell by the totals line being here. We're going to group by the year, and then we're going to sum, and we're going to see that sum labeled as aggregate sum, just so I can tell the difference between the two. Line total is the line total of revenue or the sales amount for each line item in this particular sales database. I'm going to have a domain sum also, and I'll show you the Dsum here is the function name, and I've included the field name, line total, and the table that line total is from, dim transactions, okay? If I run it, what I get is these values. So in 2011, they did this much revenue from this group of, from what the company did as far as revenue goes. The total for all of the company is this 164,564,000. It's quite a bit larger. And then we also have 2012, 2013, 2014. Well, what I did is I threw this into a spreadsheet so that I could illustrate now what it looks like if it's prettied up a little bit. So my domain sum is this 164 million. It was a little hard to see without the dollar sign and commas and so forth. Notice that the sum of all of the data here that's separated by years is this same 164,000. So the domain summary summarized everything, and the aggregate summary split it up into the years that we were grouping by. Okay? So I'm going to show you now an example using Dsum of why you might want to use this function as one of the items in your toolbox. Okay, so here I have another query. I'm grouping by the product category. I'm going to total, the line total, and I'm going to call it revenue this time. And I'm going to sort that descending. So my highest revenue is at the top, going down to my lower revenue. And what I want to know is by product category, what percent of my sales comes from each product category. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to call this percent of total. I'm going to take my revenue and divide it by my total revenue. Well, to get my total revenue, I can turn to a domain summary. So domain sum here, line total and dim transactions. It's going to return that dollar total of, I believe, 165 million, somewhere in there. But here it's going to return it as a percentage, and I've formatted this particular field as a percent. So if I run this and look at line total, and there's my revenue divided by my sum, if I run this, this is what I get. I get that this 58 million is 35% of my total sales in ovens and ranges. Refrigerators and coolers follow shortly thereafter at 26% and warmers at 23%. Gives me a good slice of my data that I can analyze and go forward and make decisions on. Okay, so there are 12 domain aggregate functions. Some are more useful than others. Some I've had more experience with than others. Here they are. Dsum is probably the most used one, possibly along with average and count. Now, sum and average and count work exactly the way you think they do. If you've used count in your totals queries or average in your totals queries, they work the same way, except they just do it over the total data set instead of the group that you set up. Now, you go a little bit further, and this is probably the least useful one. And the reason I say this is DLOOKUP looks for a particular set of data or a particular field of data in your entire data set. Now, the challenge with it is that if it doesn't find it, it just gives you a random value. It doesn't have a way to provide you with data that tells it that it errored out or couldn't find the data. It just gives you a value. So DLOOKUP I didn't find to be very useful, and so we'll move on. Okay, dmin and dmax, it'll find the minimum of the entire data set. In other words, your lowest sales account or your highest sales account. If you're looking at numbers, the lowest date versus the highest date, the employee that's been there the longest if you put dmin around it, that type of thing. dfirst and dlast, it could probably be in about the same category as DLOOKUP. dfirst and dlast just gives you the first record in the data set or the second record in the data set. If you sort it, it'll give you the first record sorted or the last record sorted. Okay, so the next one is standard deviation. A standard deviation for a population, standard variance, or a standard variance for a population. So generally you use these with criteria, and the one you would use standard deviation for a sample and the standard deviation P for a total population. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks to all those subscribers that have subscribed over time to build up our channel. Please, if you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so we can continue to grow. And if you like the video, please hit that like button. We'll look forward to seeing you later. Thanks.